So let's look at an overview of adult female reproductive function, and then we'll go back and look at the hormonal regulation of it. So gametes and steroid hormones are made in the female ovary, which is right here. So makes gametes and also steroid hormones as well. And recall that we said a woman is born with all of the ova that she's ever going to have that are stored in primary follicles. So we'll just draw some little primary follicles here. And these, that says primary follicles. And these contain the ova. And under the influence of hormones, these follicles grow, and at the time of ovulation, every month, or at least every 28 days or so, an ovum is released into the abdominal cavity. And it's then swept from the abdominal cavity into the oviduct by the fimbria. And these are sort of finger-like projections at the end of the oviduct that wave, and this is under the influence of estradiol, and the ovum is then swept up inside of the oviduct. And this structure here is called the oviduct, also known as the fallopian tube. That says, in very messy writing, oviduct. There is smooth muscle along this oviduct, and the smooth muscle, as I said before, the smooth muscle of the oviduct and fimbria are influenced by estradiol. So I'll just put estradiol there so you know that that influences this smooth muscle and this smooth muscle here. If fertilization occurs, it occurs in the oviduct. So here are some sperm, so we're going to assume that fertilization is about to happen. Fertilization. So fertilization occurs in the oviduct, and then the embryo, as it starts to divide, moves along the oviduct rather, and implants in the uterus. So implantation occurs in the uterus. Implantation. We have two layers of the uterus to be concerned about here. The muscle part, which is called the myometrium, which is smooth muscle, which towards the time of parturition, or when a baby's close to being born, more gap junctions get put in between those smooth muscle cells for coordinated contraction to expel the fetus. And then the epithelial layer, which is called the endometrium, which is where the placenta interacts with the uterus. So endometrium. So as I said, normally implantation occurs in the uterus, but occasionally implantation will occur in the oviduct, and if that occurs, then we call that an ectopic pregnancy or tubal pregnancy. So ectopic pregnancy occurs if that embryo implants in the oviduct, and that results in loss of the oviduct because it doesn't have enough of an endometrial layer or myometrium for that matter to be able to support a pregnancy. So we need to talk about the hormonal regulation that results in the cyclic release of gametes, and also the maintenance of this, the growth and maintenance of this uterine lining, which allows an embryo to implant and a fetus to develop, and then how parturition or parting of ways occurs between the mother and the fetus. So let's look at the hormonal regulation of steroidogenesis and gametogenesis in the ovary. So this is a picture of the ovary here, and we're going to look at just a little cross section of one follicle in the ovary. There are many follicles in the ovary, but usually only one starts to develop at a time and produces significant amounts of hormone and makes it to ovulation each cycle. So we're taking a look at a little piece of the dominant growing follicle here. And so just let's label the parts of this follicle to start with. So the very center of it is called the fluid is called the antral fluid. And there are two populations of cells associated with the follicle that we have to be concerned with that respond to gonadotropins. And one is the theca cells, and these are around the outside of the follicle. And these theca cells mostly secrete androgens, mostly testosterone. And the other population of cells are the granulosa cells, which are these purple ones here. And the granulosa cells mainly secrete lots of estradiol. And so they secrete estradiol into the antral fluid, and they also secrete it into the blood. And in fact, they secrete mainly estradiol, so I'll make it big. But they're also a little bit of progesterone and inhibin as well. And the androgens secreted by the theca cells, mainly testosterone, some of it goes into the blood, and some of it is actually converted to estradiol and moves into the granulosa cells. So I will put a little E2 here to remind you that it's converted to estradiol by aromatase and moves into the granulosa cells and contributes to the estradiol that builds up inside the antral fluid. So let's talk about how these activities are regulated. So we'll start up in the female hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus secretes a hormone, just like in the males, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which, as you probably already guessed, has receptors in the anterior pituitary gland. And when those receptors are stimulated by gonadotropin-releasing hormone, we have our gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone secreted. So let's do FSH first, and it is the granulosa cells that are mainly sensitive to follicle-stimulating hormone. And FSH causes growth of this follicle throughout its, during what we call the follicular growth phase. The theca cells are mainly responsive to luteinizing hormone. And as we'll see a little bit later on, as this follicle grows, it reaches a certain size and secretes enough estradiol that this triggers ovulation. And following ovulation, these theca and granulosa cells are converted to luteal cells. So, and we'll go through the details of that later. So following ovulation, the theca and granulosa cells get converted to luteal cells. And they make lots of progesterone, become a progesterone factory. One more thing we need to add to this diagram is negative feedback. So just like in the case of males, the estradiol, the progesterone, and the inhibin that are secreted from the follicle cause negative feedback to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So I will have our negative feedback going to the anterior pituitary and to the hypothalamus. And this is the basis for how oral contraceptives work. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about later is a little bit more detail about the hormonal regulation of this process throughout the follicular growth phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle.